You know, the 19th century was just an explosion of change. As the Industrial Revolution totally supercharged the West, it sent these massive shockwaves across the entire globe, forcing every other nation to react. Some ancient powers, they just collapsed under the pressure, while others rose to the challenge in, well, spectacular fashion. So that's what we're going to dig into today, this massive era of upheaval that historians call the Great Divergence.
So that really brings us to the core question, right? When you're faced with the exact same global pressures, why did some nations just crumble while others managed to completely reinvent themselves? It's a fascinating historical puzzle, and honestly, it helps explain the world we're all living in right now.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by setting the scene of the Great Divergence. Then we'll dive into three really different and fascinating stories: the paradoxical decline of India, Egypt's ambitious but ultimately failed modernization, and of course, the stunning success of Japan's Meiji Miracle. Then we'll pull it all together to see what we can learn from these three very different paths.
Okay, try to imagine a world where all the old rules are just being torn up. The engine of industry firing up in Europe. Well, it wasn't just some local thing. It was a global earthquake. It created these immense opportunities for some, and for pretty much everyone else, a very real existential threat.
And to really get just how dramatic this upheaval was, look at this number: 24.5%. In 1750, before the Industrial Revolution really hit its stride, India accounted for nearly a quarter of the entire world's manufacturing output. I mean, it was an economic titan, a global leader in textiles. This is our starting point. So first up is India, and its story is one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in all of history. How does a manufacturing powerhouse get completely deindustrialized? Now, the easy answer, the one you always hear, is, oh, the British did it. But as you're about to see, the real story is, well, it's a lot more complicated than that.
This quote just hits so hard because it captures the human cost, you know? For generations, you had these incredibly skilled artisans who were the backbone of a thriving global industry. Pushing them off their looms and onto farms wasn't just some economic statistic, it represented a fundamental and painful reshaping of Indian society. It was a loss of economic independence.
And this table, wow, this just lays out the collapse in stark black and white. In 1800, India was still a net exporter of textiles. But by 1877, foreign imports, mostly from Britain, had captured over 60% of its own home market. That is a catastrophic 70 percentage point swing in just over 75 years. It's staggering.
But here's where the paradox comes in, a real head-scratcher. If this was just a simple story of cheap British goods flooding the market, you'd expect India's terms of trade, so the price of its exports compared to its imports, to have shot through the roof, just like they did everywhere else. But they didn't, not even close. So what else was going on? Well, the story really has two sides. Yes, of course, the external shock from British industry was immense. There's no denying that. But that shock hit a subcontinent that was already deeply, deeply vulnerable because of its own internal reality.
And this is what's so often overlooked, a perfect storm of internal crises. The powerful Mughal Empire collapsed, leading to political chaos and constant warfare. At the exact same time, agriculture was slumping, thanks in no small part to a series of awful, prolonged droughts. These internal problems basically crippled India's economy from the inside out, making it a sitting duck for outside pressure.
All right, let's move on to our second case. Because unlike India's more, let's say, passive decline, Egypt, under its incredible ruler Muhammad Ali, made a bold, aggressive push to modernize and industrialize, and to do it on its own terms. I mean, Muhammad Ali had this incredibly clear vision: build a powerful Egyptian empire. And he knew that meant having a modern army, a modern economy, and modern infrastructure. He wasn't going to just sit around and wait for the West to show up at his doorstep. No way. He was determined to build a state that could beat them at their own game.
And you can see that ambition right here. Projects like the Delta barrages on the Nile were symbols of this grand vision. I mean, these were massive, technologically advanced public works designed to completely revolutionize Egyptian agriculture, especially for valuable cash crops like cotton. The ambition was just undeniable.
But this chart, wow, this chart reveals the fatal flaw in the whole plan. Look at this. In 1833, over half, more than 50% of the entire state budget was being spent on the military. Now, compare that. 53% for war, but only about 4% for the stuff meant to actually build the economy, like factories and bridges. Everything was secondary to military power.
So you can see how this all played out, right? It's a path straight to bankruptcy. You have constant, expensive wars, a rigid state-controlled economy that stifled any real growth, and massive foreign loans to pay for it all. It created a debt trap. And by the 1870s, Egypt was bankrupt, which opened the door for Britain and France to step in and take control. Ambition alone, it turns out, just wasn't enough. And that brings us to our third and completely different story, Japan. Faced with the very same external pressures, Japan didn't decline and it didn't fail. Instead, it executed one of the most stunning national transformations in the history of the world. Just look at this before and after snapshot. The difference is night and day. In 1868, Japan was a feudal agricultural society, forced into these humiliating, unequal treaties by Western powers. Fast forward to 1912, and it has a strong, centralized government, a powerful modern military, and a booming industrial sector. It literally remade itself from the ground up.
And the pace, the sheer speed of this transformation was absolutely breathtaking. I mean, within just a few years of the Meiji Restoration, feudalism was gone, a modern conscript army was in place, and by 1905, Japan had defeated a major European power, Russia, in a major war. That sent shockwaves across the entire globe.
So what was their secret sauce? How did they pull this off? Well, they had a methodical, comprehensive blueprint. And this is the key difference. They didn't just focus on the military, like Egypt did. They unified the country, created a national tax system, built key industries, and then, this is huge, they educated the entire population and reformed their legal system to gain international respect. It was a total social revolution, driven from the very top.
Okay, so let's bring these three stories back together. We've got India's decline, Egypt's failed attempt, and Japan's stunning success, all happening in the same turbulent world. So what's the final takeaway here? This table just lays it all out, side by side, so clearly. India was overwhelmed by that toxic mix of internal weakness and external pressure. Egypt pursued a narrow, military-first strategy that just wasn't sustainable. But Japan undertook a comprehensive, internally driven revolution that transformed every single aspect of its society. The strategy, in the end, determined the outcome. So when you boil it all down, it wasn't just about the shockwave coming from the West. That was a given. Success or failure really came down to internal factors. Was the state unified? Were its priorities strategic and balanced? Could it manage foreign pressure without breaking? Japan got a yes on all three counts. And this brings us to a final, really powerful question. The paths these nations took during the Great Divergence set them on trajectories that lasted for over a century. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How are the choices being made by nations right now about their own unity, their priorities, and how they engage with the world shaping their destinies for the century to come?